Welcome, everybody. While you're watching slides go by, congratulations to Aram Calhoun in the second row here for an award she got last week. And a couple wonderful students who I think go by in a little bit who got the Edith Patch Awards, Brian Klaus and Chris Hoffman. Chris works with Aram. We're almost to the end of the semester. We have one more talk next Monday here. Matt Scott, who's been working for decades with Maine DEP, talking about the history of Maine lakes and pollution issues. But a really wonderful talk we'll have this fall, the Mitchell Lecture by Tom Dietz from Michigan State, a leading sociologist, human ecologist. Not sure that that's exactly the talk he'll give. I've been talking, we're going back and forth. I think he may shift the subject once a little bit based on the current political climate that we're in, and how he's updated his thinking about what role science and science communication should be playing in our society. Who was out for a march last weekend? March for Science? Good for you. Thanks. So today, it's a great pleasure to have Carly Sponarski here to talk. Actually, she was scheduled to give this talk, I don't know when, in February, when we had one of thousands of blizzards that pinned Aaron Strong and me down on the ground for one of those trips. And it's just been really great. I just began to get to know Carly maybe earlier last fall, and to me she represents this kind of growing wealth of expertise we have in human dimensions research, and you'll hear more about that today. But she's got a really interesting background, started out on the straight and narrow path with a biology degree, the bachelor's level, animal biology, but then started broadening out, got a degree in environmental science from the University of Calgary. The first one was from UBC, and then went on to do her PhD at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And that was a geography department program, after which she was at Nicole Ardwin's lab, the social ecology lab at Stanford, where she was doing postdoctoral research before she arrived here. Really interesting work on human dimensions of especially wildlife and fisheries management issues. Cool studies of human-coyote interactions, including structural equation modeling and lots of cool stuff. But what really caused me to be reminded how helpful and how wonderful it is to have Carly and others here was I was actually at a talk last week. I don't know who else went to the Libby Lecture on Natural Resource Policy. But this guy who spoke, Ken Williams, has had what I think is probably about 40 years of experience, having done his master's degrees in both mathematics and statistics, and then a rangeland ecology, so a kind of biophysical research PhD. And he was summarizing, in a way, his whole career. And one key slide at some point was basically to say something that I think a lot of us have sort of had this moment of awakening, kind of, that he basically said that the real big scientific frontier and the key to solving problems was human dimensions research. And so I think it's really great. That doesn't mean that the people who are biophysical scientists like me don't have key roles to play, but boy, do we need the help of a lot of social scientists. So it's great to have you here today, Carly. Please join me in welcoming you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone for coming today. I actually thought I might have like an audience of 5, since I'm competing with the undergraduate research symposium today. So it's really, I really appreciate everyone taking this time to come and hear my talk. And thank you, David, for a wonderful introduction. Today I'm going to be a little selfish, because typically when I'm asked to give a talk, and particularly when it comes to wildlife management agencies, I have to highlight the very applied nature of my work and how the data that I collect can directly influence policy and what decisions managers should and shouldn't make based on that data. But today I'm going to be selfish because in my passion, I really, really enjoy modeling human behavior. And so I'm going to be very theoretical today. So pre-apologies if you're expecting an applied presentation, but I'm going to show you at the base of what I basically frame most of my research paradigms out of, and how that leads to strong applied work when I'm working with management agencies. And I think what's really important to start off with is a story. because during my interview, which was scarily just a year ago, amazing how that comes by very quickly, a colleague of mine, Joseph Zaleski, asked me, because my work is highly involved, and I think I have an up on maybe biologists, is I actually get to talk to the species that I research, and they communicate back to me, which is really helpful, is that, how do I separate myself from my research? As a scientist, we are supposed to operate outside of our research paradigm, and I think as scientists, you're kidding yourself if you think you can separate yourself from your research, because you are personally invested in it. And so my story, in a way, shows why I'm personally invested. So I grew up in a very different location, Vancouver, British Columbia, and what is an absolutely beautiful city, but what is fantastic about this city is that it is so interconnected with the natural environment that is around it. It's very accepting of urban wildlife, but also to the point of my aunt who lives on the North Shore would commonly have black bears or potentially grizzly bears coming into her backyard come the spring. And that just kind of happens in this environment. But as a child, I was kind of reminded when I saw Ram Calhoun's talk last week, and she was talking about where she played as a child. And I played in tidal pools on the west coast of British Columbia. And I loved as a child poking and prodding, and they probably weren't as happy with me. But then as an undergrad, I learned that their nervous system's not as advanced as ours. But this is what got me really interested in the exploration of my communities that lived around me, lived amongst people. And this is a shot, basically from this Inner Harbor area where there's a ton of human use. But also as I grew up, a large controversy, like a big conservation push in British Columbia was conserving the spirit bear in the temperate rainforest. I was a student participant in a large youth group that tried to advocate to the provincial government to actually protect the temperate rainforest, and it succeeded. It is a black bear. If anyone isn't familiar with the spirit bear, this is basically an albino black bear, but has incredible cultural significance to the local Indigenous people of British Columbia. I also, though, very luckily got to basically everywhere I went, I got to see amazing wildlife that not every child gets to see and value. And I'm also a product of zoos and aquariums where I was able to go and interact with researchers and hear about the cool conservation they were doing, and just come to appreciate the massive biodiversity that surrounds us. And I think if you ever go to Vancouver, the Vancouver Aquarium is a definitely go-to place to see. It's a beautiful aquarium that just focuses, much like the Monterey Bay Aquarium, on local species and trying to conserve those animals. The belugas are eventually being phased out. So obviously, my father doesn't know exactly where I came from because he is a businessman. He's like, where did you find this love for nature? But it happened quite naturally in my childhood. And as Dave was mentioning, my undergraduate research became an incredible kind of turning point in my research. And luckily, I was able to study these two very, what don't seem like very related species. On the right, we have Plesiomata species. It's a colonial spider species in South America, particularly in Ecuador. They're colonial, so that means that they live in orbs, and they live separately, but they do help with hunting and resource allocations. And then, of course, for randomly, there's a conservation farm in Langley, British Columbia, that has the largest captive pack of African wild dogs. So I got to study their social systems as an undergrad. And they both regurgitate food for their young, which is their common behavior. But I learned two very valuable lessons during my undergraduate experience. Even though as a child I idolized Jane Goodall and Jane Fossey and Bairute Galdakos, who studies orangutans, particularly Bairute, when I was out in the forest studying those spider species, my favorite part of the day was coming home to base camp and talking to people about what I saw. I didn't necessarily enjoy measuring how high this one spider web was above another and finding out their social dynamics. It wasn't as much intriguing as then talking to the people, and particularly talking to the local people who are conserving the rainforest in that area. And so the two with my big highlight was, I really like people. I enjoy hearing their stories. I enjoy understanding where they come from. And at this point in my life, my mother kind of had that teenage duh moment where she's like, you really didn't know this about yourself? Like, are you really 21 years old? Like, come on. Like, I've known this since you were a child. Like, you love interacting with people. As much as you love the cute and fuzzies and the scales and the spiny animals, you love people. And you really like understanding what makes them tick. So then I go off and do a bunch of grad work. And what I find in my grad is this discipline that really hit, I found my home. And for those who aren't as familiar with it, it's called Human Dimensions of Wildlife. And in wildlife, I consider it all species on Earth. It's not just terrestrial, it's not just marine, it's everything that inhabits this planet. And what I really love about this discipline and what really inspires me is that it tries to understand why and how people value wildlife, how they want wildlife to be managed, how they affect and are affected by wildlife, and how knowing this information can affect wildlife decision making when it comes to management planning. And so to just give you a bit of a background, this discipline stemmed out of, well, the eradication of most megafauna on the North American terrestrial ecosystem. At a certain point, when we couldn't find any more bison to kill or wolves to capture or beaver pellets to harvest, we realized very quickly that we needed to understand how people are using the resources and how can we work with people to come to certain management decisions that work for everybody, that conserve the species but also allow people to continue to do the behaviors on the landscape that they enjoy doing. There's my advisor. Apparently he likes calling at any time in the day. I thought that was on mute. Anyways, so, advisors, they always want to be involved in everything. The discipline of human dimensions was really coined at a conference in 1970. And it really burgeoned out of understanding how wildlife, like hunters and fishermen or anglers, wanted wildlife to be managed. So it's a very applied discipline. And since then, this discipline really works. It's like a person, the way I'm speaking about it. But it likes to kind of pull things from a variety of other more well-established disciplines like social psychology, sociology. And that's kind of what I like to do in my research. And I've been doing it since I was an undergrad. I like seeing what other people are up to and just bringing it over so it works for what questions I have to answer. And so in terms of the more applied, through different statistics or through the way we ask certain questions, these tools help to conceptualize, measure, and understand, and more importantly, communicate how human interactions support management decision making. And I think it's really important is the communication portion today. In my experiences, it takes a lot of trust for a management agency to open themselves up to public comment, even though they're technically supposed to, on certain policy adjustments. But it can be scary because, of course, humans actually can speak our language, whereas if you impose a policy on a bear, they might not necessarily be able to speak up for themselves. But I think it's very important to help understand the general population and what they want, what they don't want, and not always listen to those polarized views. Because the media, for example, plays into that. We have newspaper articles that are typically written on the more negative or positive portions of an issue, i.e., there was one recently, the Bear Ballot Initiative. And so you hear a lot of these polarized views, but not necessarily from the middle, which is pretty much where most of the population resides. And if we're in a democracy, majority rules, supposedly. And, being able to survey human populations and generalize their attitudes across, whether it's a management unit or a state or a city, allows government to actually make informed decisions. Now, I'm going to play a little game with you guys. You're going to have to interact. My classes love this, I think. I'm going to simplify this game, though. You're basically going to have to agree or disagree. There's no neutral. There's no unsure. You have to agree or you have to disagree with a statement. And I'll ask, you just have to put your hands up. But I kind of want to gauge my audience. I have a feeling I know what the answer is going to be, but we'll see. So, first question. Humans should manage wildlife populations so that humans benefit? Who would agree? Whoa. Okay, that's better than I thought I was gonna. And who would disagree? Some of you aren't playing this game. It's okay. You're the neutrals in my returns. I know. Second question. Animals should have rights similar to the rights of humans. Interesting. Okay. And disagree? Okay. I already caught Hamish on one. I was eyeing. He answered the second question, though. And then the third question. People who want to hunt should have the opportunity to do so. Agree?
What are they hunting?
Well, obviously legal. Hunting in the legal. See, you opened it up to public comment. You don't know what you're going to get back. And disagree with that statement. Did you disagree the first time? It's a possibility. And finally, I appreciate you being patient with me. I value the sense of companionship I receive from animals. Agree? Okay, I thought I had that. Okay, and disagree? I like you're being brave, Linda. Thank you. So, I'm going to explain this activity in a moment, but you have to bear with me for a bit longer. Okay, now this is the bit more of active participation. What feelings or emotions or words come to mind when you see an animal like this?
It's so cute.
Horror.
Horror? I like that. Anyone else? More than like a sound? Cute, I think. Okay, what about an animal like this? God, I knew I shouldn't have given this. If you were my grandmother, you would run out of this room right now, seeing an animal like this, despite it just being a picture and she understands that. But what's really interesting about the variety of biodiversity is sometimes often communicating the importance of everything from the cute lesser panda or red panda to a tarantula species that if people only knew how they walked, they would just be blown away by how awesome spiders are. But I'm also biased. And so we have this kind of spectrum of attitudes and values, and layered on top of that, we also have animals and we have different people view them differently. And this is what I'm very interested in. And so if you're someone like Steve Irwin, who I saw his son on a talk show the other day, he's 13 years old and he's like, it's terrifyingly how similar he is to his father. But if you're someone like Steve Irwin, it's conservation for conservation's sake. They're awesome, they're amazing animals, they have a role in the ecosystem, they need to be conserved. But then you have someone else who might see them as a food source, who might see them as a method of material to make clothing out of, an economic resource. You also have someone who might just see them as a nuisance animal and a potential danger. And so you layer on all these different types of attitudes, it makes a very complex system, much like our ecosystems. And that's just in how we socially interact with these animals and how we think about them, and like the stories, down to the stories we were told about them as children. These have great effects on how we view wildlife and their importance on this landscape to today. So how do I dissect this complicated web of cognitions and emotions and values? Well, I generally use a theoretical approach called the cognitive hierarchy. And in this, it's an inverted pyramid for a reason. At the bottom you have values. I'm going to be explaining these different cognitions in a moment. But I think the key to remember is this arrow actually to the right of the pyramid. So in the bottom, you have values, and they are few in number. They're incredibly slow to change to the point of not changing. Our values are actually set in us at about age 7 or 8, and we have them the rest of our lives. So maybe getting children early for biodiversity conservation is really important. They are incredibly central to our belief systems, and they transcend situations. And as we move up this pyramid, what you're going to get, and this is one of the reasons why it's inverted, is because you want to get the sense that your attitudes will be more numerous than your values, and your behaviors are even more numerous in terms of the numbers of behaviors you can perform than your attitudes. But let's break this down by cognition. So first of all, we have values. We often say, I really highly value biodiversity. You don't actually value biodiversity. You believe in it, and you have a positive attitude towards it. A value is actually an enduring belief that is a specific mode of conduct and personally or socially preferable to an opposite or converse mode of conduct or end state of existence. Whew. So basically, you believe in honesty or dishonesty. It's basic. It has nothing to do with more nuanced things like wildlife conservation. It's just basic kind of values of life. And then we move into basic beliefs or value orientations. And these are what people think are to be true, even though they might not be. But they're not necessarily fact. But if you look at where it's positioned, value orientations are basic beliefs. Whether it's true or not, they highly influence your attitudes and your norms. They also highly influence your behavioral intentions. And then at the end is your behaviors. And these basic beliefs then influence your attitudes. And attitudes are a mental state reflected by cognitive beliefs or affective emotions. And so cognitive beliefs could be whether an object, basically an object, it's just basically whether you think an object is good or bad, harmful or beneficial, positive or negative. And today's talk, we're actually going to be looking at how we insert emotions into this cognitive hierarchy, because it's much more complex than just asking someone, do you like wolves, do you not like wolves? It's much harder to get at. And that was what some of my work is trying to kind of crack at. And so norms, if you're not familiar, are shared beliefs concerning the acceptability of a particular action. So is it acceptable to smoke is one. That is a societal norm that has really shifted in the last 50 years. Other norms is whether it's okay to, shoot wildlife outside of season, and that will vary depending on where you live, whether you even need to get a permit or not, for example. Lastly, we have behavioral intention, which is kind of exactly what it means. It's like, and this is when it comes to behavior, this is where I've mostly played in, is like, what would you do given a certain scenario? What would you predict yourself doing? Whereas behaviors is actually what you actually do in a given scenario. So as you can see that each of these cognitions build on each other and they influence one another until you perform the behavior. Okay, so got through that theory portion, and now we're going to dive into some of my work that's done on human-coyote conflicts. I personally find coyotes incredibly intriguing, and one of the reasons is because they are this highly adaptable mesocarnivore on our landscape that since European settlement in North America, their populations have exploded. And one of the reasons is their adaptability. They can be found anywhere, but they also then means they run into conflict with human beings. And so, they can depredate on our livestock, they can be found in our children's playgrounds, they can be found under our porch or feeding or competing for resources with our dogs. They also can unfortunately sometimes take pets. And so this leads this animal to being a very interesting species to study when it comes to human wildlife conflict because of the diversity of different conflicts. And so during a research project that I did in Cape Breton Highlands National Park, which if you're not overly familiar, just head north in Maine, cross through New Brunswick, and you have to cross the Canso Causeway onto Cape Breton Island. If you haven't gone, I'll be Cape Breton Tourism right now. It's spectacular, and the park is the best part. But anyways, one of the reasons I was brought into this project was because the park had perceived they had a coyote problem. And what they wanted to see happen was they wanted people and coyotes to move away from one another. They didn't want to have coyotes going into human areas, but it's hard in a park because, the whole park is basically a coyote area, and people are also trying to recreate. So how can we understand the types of conflicts human beings are coming into contact with coyotes, and how can we kind of mitigate this through education? And so Again, as I mentioned, the Canso Causeway, it's a land bridge. Cape Breton actually wasn't attached to Canada in any capacity until the I think it was built in 1955, 1960. 10 to 15 years later, tons of species made it across that Canso Causeway, including the coyote. The park knew the coyotes were in the park, but they never really did anything. Up until about the year 2000, where they started noticing more reported human incidences with coyotes, but pretty much everything was benign. Until unfortunately in 2009, Taylor Mitchell was hiking on the trail in the park and was unfortunately killed by 3 coyotes while hiking by herself. And at this stage, the park kind of took note and was like, oh no, we need to figure out what's going on and how do we mitigate this conflict, because 1, they didn't want to be lethally removing coyotes for no reason, and 2, they knew, as most parks do, that the first step is dealing with people and educating people on how to behave appropriately with wildlife. And so this is where I kind of jump in. If anyone's interested in more of the applied aspects of this project, about management options, about how people, their levels of fear or their levels of like their behavioral reaction to different coyote scenarios, please come talk to me after this. But this is where I'm going to be selfish and talk about the theory. So yet again, here's our inverted pyramid. I used a structural equation model to look at value orientation, so looking mostly at basic belief patterns, how that relates to attitudes, and how that then morphs into a behavioral intention of a want, the acceptability of lethal control versus non-lethal control of a coyote. But where do emotions come in? That's the whole point of this talk. Well, if you remember that definition of attitudes, so there's the cognitive component and the affective component. And affective hasn't been traditionally studied very well. And emotions generally don't have a great definition. They're competing in the literature, but generally, as we all can maybe, it seems really obvious, emotions definitely have a physical response, such as your heart rate going up. I would if I had a grizzly bear approaching me, for example. You have physical expressions, much like the multiple expressions on this, but it also can revolt into running away, for example, or standing your ground. There is a, as I just said, behavioral response as well, and then of course, there's the cognitive component of you actually understanding and translating that physical experience that you're having into a cognition that you understand. So, for example, if you see a snake and you're scared of it, your brain has done the work to translate that emotion into a word or a concept that you actually can understand and then can communicate to the world. And so in my work, I tend this cognitive experience is typically called is actually emotional dispositions. It's how we effectively communicate to other people how we feel what we're feeling and what we're feeling what we feel. And so when I talk about emotions, I'm mostly talking about these emotional dispositions. It's how people communicate their level of fear. And so this article that I'm going to be going through was published in Human Dimensions of Wildlife. And I tackled 2 main questions. One, will general attitudes mediate the relationship between existence values and emotional dispositions and support or opposition for management action? And the second question, does this relationship between these cognitions differ depending on the types of scenarios a person is put through? And these scenarios were, if a coyote crosses the trail and then approaches you, and then the super terrifying coyote approaches the trail snarling, which you might think that these are interesting choices in terms of scenarios, but when you look at the literature and the chances of actually having a coyote attack you as an adult human being, it's slim to none. And so we needed to find some way of incorporating a certain level of severity of fear without also communicating that there is a chance that coyote could attack you, when really what our research shows is it's very, very minimal. We didn't want to raise any more negative attitudes than already existed in this study area. And so I spent 2 glorious years. It was really hard data collection. I'm just telling you, outside on a mountaintop, it was really hard. Asking people questions about coyotes. But today we're going to focus on the residents, because the residents in this study area, if you've seen or read some of my other articles, they're the ones that were really affected by Taylor's death. And it really changed the way they interact with the park, but also how they use the trail systems that are in their own backyard, really. And so we did a mail-out questionnaire and got a 72% return rate, which if you're not used to social science data, they're usually like, jeez, apparently he really wants to talk to me. Just gonna keep going. Anyway, so proposed model. So again, from the research questions, you have those basic beliefs, symbolic existence beliefs. You have the general attitudes, a negative relationship to emotional dispositions, which then have a positive relationship to the acceptability of lethal control. And much like that pyramid, but think of it flipped on its side, we're going from general concepts of human cognition to more specific. Okay, now, just so I am bolstering up what we did, we have different questionnaire items that feed into the general concept. The confirmatory factor analysis and reliability test showed that we could merge these items into one construct. The models fit statistically, but what's really interesting is, okay, let's look at the models. Scenario 1. So we have a pretty benign situation. I mean, it's general wildlife viewing in a national park. A coyote crosses the trail. What we found really interesting here is that, so solid lines obviously have a significant relationship. If there's no line, the relationship was not significant. And so you have these symbolic beliefs and symbolic existence beliefs in your general attitudes having a significant influence on people's emotional dispositions of the scenario. What's interesting here, though, is the relationship from these cognitions. Only symbolic existence beliefs actually had a relationship with that lethal control, which you would expect having a certain amount of cognitive influence on your decision making to accept or to be okay or not okay with lethal control. Between scenario 1 and 2, we don't get much of a difference. Some of the relationships are a little weaker. But what's really interesting here is that when you go to the most severe scenario, the cognitive influence on your emotional reaction is just gone. But your emotional disposition still has an effect on your ability to accept how acceptable or unacceptable it is to make that management, to support that management decision of lethal control. And this was there's only been like a handful, like three or four articles published on the effects of emotional disposition on management options, but also just its role in the cognitive hierarchy, which really this final scenario made me very interested in pursuing this as part of my research program here at the University of Maine. So again, as you see, the relationships do shift between the three models, but again, the take-home point is actually this loss of connection between your cognitive and your emotional response. Okay, so we found out that, yeah, emotional dispositions definitely play a role in the acceptability of a management option. Our hypotheses were supported, and in more benign situations, the cognitions played really pinpoint. Those questions are value orientation-based questions, and the way you answer those questions tell me basically which side of the spectrum you are. Are you more traditional or anthropogenic, or are you more biocentric in your viewpoints? And basically just knowing that, I have an ability to understand how you're probably going to answer the rest of my questionnaire based on your basic values. And so with this shift, I think it's really important for wildlife managers to understand the shift in basis, that traditionally North American wildlife management agencies have been managing for the hunters and the anglers, and more their constituents aren't looking for that type of resource. That means funding bases might have to change, but also they might have to start communicating with a whole new group of people that for them are understudied because they haven't been brought into the conversation as much as someone that hunts. And so whether you're the cute and fuzzy, the sharp and toothy, I think it's really important nowadays to come at conservation in a creative manner that's inclusive and understanding the people who interact with the species. Because unless you do that, well, you're kind of climbing up a ladder without legs. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators over the years. Jerry, who obviously is very excited to talk to me, is represented in this slide. And with that, I would like to open it up to any questions that people have.
Plenty of time.
Have you done much research on the conflict between the two human user groups of the consumptionist and then the
So Carol told me I had to repeat questions. Okay. So the question was if I had done any research on the competition or the conflicts between the different user groups, such as hunters and more eco-tourists. I haven't done any primary literature on it, primary research on it. One of the pieces of research I did coming out of the Coyote Project was looking at how residents and visitors differ, and their value orientations did differ. And even though the residents understood that the national park was there to conserve, they didn't necessarily they also understood that if the park had coyotes, their backyards had coyotes, and they weren't necessarily as supportive. Whereas with park visitors, who you could say were more biocentric in their viewpoints, wanted the park to conserve biodiversity. And coyotes, even though depending on your frame, your frame could say they're an invasive species because they dispersed into the area. They valued having that animal there on the landscape.
Carly, can you go back to your 3 scenarios slide? Just because I'm not going to remember the names of things.
It's okay. Almost
So-
there.
So
Mm-hmm.
if you look at scenario 1 and 3,
Yeah.
are you saying, is part of your research looking at how you can reconnect the emotional disposition with symbolic, what you're calling the cognitive part?
Mm-hmm.
Is the goal to try to figure out how you bring that back around to rational thought? Or am I missing something?
No, you're not. So the question was, is my research wanting to look in how we can reconnect the cognitive components, which are the existence, beliefs, and general attitudes, back to the emotional disposition? I don't think that you couldn't do that, but I think that the fact that there is a disconnect means that you need to understand all of the affective and the cognitive components in order to help mitigate conflict. That they might not necessarily be able to be relinked.
So the point is to dig deeper into the emotional disposition
Mhm.
one and figure out what's
Yeah.
driving that,
Mhm.
and maybe address that. Is that what you're
Yeah.
How did you assess emotional disposition in this context?
Yeah. So the question was, how did I assess emotional disposition in this context? So for each scenario was asked the exact same questions, just different scenarios. So for each question, I asked people whether the general experience was positive or negative on a 7-point spectrum, and then the emotional dispositions, I actually picked 8 emotions, like excited, not excited, worried, not worried, scared, not scared, anxious. That had kind of we took that body of emotional dispositions from the phobia literature that typically works on spiders and snakes, for example, to kind of let that guide which emotions we included. Yeah. Laura?
Have you thought at all about including measures of information processing in your work? Just it strikes me that oftentimes you see this disconnect between, people are sort of systematically thinking really hard about a message and that cognitive brain is engaged versus I'm scared and the heuristic.
Yep.
And the heuristic
Mm-hmm.
Just curious.
Yeah, so I might not even actually be able to repeat that question. Sorry, Laura. The question was kind of looking at what have I thought of including how people are processing that information versus like are they really going off of an emotion versus a knowledge basis. And I haven't done that in my work thus far, but it's something that I would like to include. But it's always hard. I was amazed at the response rate I got because this was a 12-page questionnaire on top of the 2-page questionnaire they had to do on the trail. So it was already a debate on which questions got to stay in versus were kicked out. And so given the space to include that in something, definitely. Yeah. Allie?
I'm just curious, to what extent do you think that like the behavioral intention is actually predictive of what the behavior would be?
It's not actually. Oh, question. Sorry. How predictive do you think the behavioral intention is of actually the behavior? The literature, I haven't necessarily been able to study the direct link to behavior yet. Not that I'm not interested in it at all, but based on the literature, it's actually not as strongly connected as you think you would predict. Because behaviors are influenced by so many things that, you know, I think of things that I've done in my past that are like, why did I behave that way? That wouldn't be how I would have predicted my behavior. But there's a certain, I think that, and then again, that's I think why emotions are so important to understand, because particularly when you're dealing with contentious issues and, you know, charismatic megafauna are a perfect example, and wolves in particular have been studied extensively, is that you just, that emotional component of like why a rancher may or may not want wolves on their land, I think can hopefully explain a little bit more that discrepancy between, you know, their behavioral intention or potentially looking at their behavior as well.
If no one else has a question, go ahead.
Okay. Your narrative shared such an importance of environmental immersion
Mm-hmm.
in developing of these values.
Yeah.
And there's also such enthusiasm right now for STEM education.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe sometimes STEM education might take up some of the classroom time from these other environmentally immersive
Mm-hmm.
Scholastic goals.
Mm-hmm.
How would you see incorporating these values with current ideas about education in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a long question again. I have to repeat it. I was kind of, my narrative around, you know, my experiences and why I got into it really show kind of the value of environmental education, and how may I also want to incorporate that into the way I educate, but also potentially into the research. I think that active participation education is really important nowadays. My last seminar in my department for my job talk actually went into an education program that I designed where I had people actually physically going through motions of coyote safety to the point of hitting a coyote on, well, it was a wooden sawhorse really, with a stick to actually teach them how to physically react to a coyote if it was an attack. And what we found out was that, you know, teaching them about, well, it's BAM, back away, act big, make noise, and they just left out the F, which is fight back if you really needed to. But it was amazing to see the transformation in people's attitudes, and there's going to be I have a paper right now that I'm writing, hopefully submitting this summer, where we actually did a 2-year retention study to see how much of that information was actually retained by participants. What we found actually was that people's attitudes between the pre and the post test were elevated, which usually happens after like a really exciting experience. But is that elevated change in attitude extended over a year period? And what we found is like, yes. And what we also found was that people actually still felt like they were in control of a situation, that the likelihood of having a coyote attack was actually rather small. And so I think it's really important that when we're educating as environmental scientists is to think about how do we make this fun, how do we make this engaging, and how do we make it an impact? And because I think that, you know, if you remember about those moments of your life that kind of made you who you are today, they tend to be big. Maybe not big for everybody that was in the audience, but for me, there's a few key moments that were big light bulb moments as a child that steered me in like, for example, my career trajectory. Yeah. Kirsty.
It was either her student or her husband. I'm wondering, these scenario-based questions,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you found that the relationship is pretty similar between 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And then scenario 3, it's the least likely event to occur.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I mean, I guess that would require different message frame or different types of message.
Yeah.
What did the national park do with, or
what were their messages,
Yeah.
and if they haven't changed, what should they be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is that you have varying levels of change between the different scenarios, and how did this information affect the park's messaging to park visitors or residents? What was interesting is prior to this study, what they really wanted to tackle was visitor issues, and what we found actually, and one of the reasons why the residents are a much more interesting story, is that the visitors were either completely unaware that coyotes were there and not scared of them either, or we had other questions about feeding issues and things like that, and we didn't necessarily have that issue, but through conversation, because I did interview about 1,200 people on the trails over 2 years, is that it was actually the residents who were feeding the visitors stories. And so they were actually advocating differently than what the park was saying. And so the park realized through this research is that actually they had to tackle communication issues with the residents, how to help train them in terms of feeling comfortable while hiking, and actually also, I think the hard part about, again, research and context, at this point we had a conservative government in Canada that was just slicing and dicing any environmental related program, and Parks Canada was on the chopping block. They actually have a Black Friday, which happened in the middle of or Black Monday, which happened in the middle of my dissertation, where I think it was like 10 or 15% of park staff were fired. And so Parks Canada just didn't even have the manpower to deal with the residents. So, but by working with me and the rest of my team, we were able then to spend the time being the advocates and working with the residents and talking to them, to the point that the education program that I was speaking about earlier is now being used by the park in their summer programming. Joe?
So, you talked a lot about how your background influences kind of your outlook on this generally. So do you feel, this is kind of a high level question, with the world generally urbanizing, and that's going to affect a lot of people's outlooks, is there any research into, like you kind of talked about STEM research, STEM education, that sort of thing, like where people are going to be going, and how do you kind of bring them back, or should you, or because they're going to kind of start to become more tourist of nature rather than parts of nature?
Yeah. So the question is that in an ever urbanizing human environment, how do we use education, or how do we include this in our research in terms of accounting for this potential disconnect between an urban human population versus like the rural, or or to a certain extent, some people who are more maybe environmentally minded. It's a tough question, because I mean, there's been a lot of literature written about the disconnect that we are going through with nature, and the undervaluing it completely, and urbanization is leading to that. But I think that there is such a biodiversity that live in our urban environments as well, that we don't necessarily need to get on a bus and go to Baxter State Park. We can do kind of citizen-based science in our high school or elementary school right in an urban environment. It doesn't necessarily need that big field trip. I was fortunate that, yes, in my own personal story, I got to go out to those places a lot. But I think getting people to value their place is also very, very important, and to understand that, an urban environment doesn't mean a desolate environment either. You have another question, Ron? I think you're clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, your comment on if you got the answers to our first three, you could pretty much predict what the rest of our answers would be to your surveys. Have you tested that? Because I think that I answered heartfelt in a way that would put me in both categories.
Yep.
So I'm worried about that.
I don't need to worry about what you pay.
You're actually in an emerging group.
Thank you.
You're novel and interesting, Aram. So sorry, the question was, let me just go, as we all know, Aram's question was about the fact that when I asked the questions that were value orientation based, whether, on one end you have the very like wildlife is a resource, we must use it. On the far right, we have, basically wildlife is your best buddy, colloquially speaking. And then we have something in the middle. And what we're noticing now in the literature with value orientations is actually that, at a certain point in time, about 20 years ago, we definitely had these like very strong polarized issues. What we're now finding is that there's this weird, interesting group in the middle that not only values, like they may personally value non-consumptive behaviors, but they also respect someone else's right to choose what they deserve. And so that is a group that I think is very interesting and potentially much easier to work with, because in that way they've already negotiated the fact that they recognize, these groups recognize that people might not have the same basic belief patterns as they do, but they also respect. So you're the group that's easier to work with. Thank you. But I think we knew that. Anyone else? Mac?
So where would you put all the Leopolds in those three groups?
I think all the Leopolds with Aram.
So a weirdo, but one who lived decades ago,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you know.
but wasn't necessarily a weirdo in the sense that he was, at a certain extent, an outlier. Yeah.
So
Jack?
if you're focusing on mitigating human-wildlife conflict, would you say you focus more on the residents or you focus more on the visitors?
It depends on where you are. Sorry for a horrible answer or a non-precise answer. So Jack asked the question of whether, if you're mitigating conflict, do you concentrate on the resident or do you concentrate on the visitor? And I think that really depends on where you are. I think, what makes Cape Breton Highlands National Park a really interesting park is it's really isolated. You need to want to go there. It's absolutely beautiful, and what's also interesting about the park is that it's surrounded by the Cabot Trail, and so a lot of the users literally don't go 20 feet, max 50 feet outside of their car at any time, and the only trail that they hike is the one that Taylor was killed on, if they hike. And if they hike, sometimes it's in high heels. It was very interesting. I wouldn't necessarily want to hike 5K in high heels, but everyone has their own footwear choices. But I think, so with the types of visitors that were here, which were very car-based, tended to be of an older demographic who weren't necessarily, weren't going to be necessarily interacting with wildlife except for through the window of their vehicle. The visitors weren't necessarily an issue that the park had to deal with, whereas the residents were the ones who, they use the park 365 days a year, and the park bleeds right into their background. This is an area, much like Maine, where there's no fences. It's weird if someone puts a fence around their yard. And there's tons of just community trails that people just upkeep, and people share where to hunt, and it's definitely a smattering of towns around the park that use it very much for resource-based consumption and love walking. But when Taylor died, particularly women didn't want to even put out their garbage in fear of being attacked by coyotes. It was a very severe reaction. Anyone else?
Let's thank Carly again for a wonderful time.